regional newspapers in Pennsylvania, the Allentown Morning Call. And then he went on to the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he was their online editor for a while. And then he decided to go to California and slum it as an entertainment writer, editor for Variety.com, HollywoodReporter.com. But then he missed the cheesesteaks. So he went back to Philly, where he worked with, we have this innovator in local media named Jim Brady, and Jim Brady and Chris worked together to create this really amazing, but unfortunately relatively short-lived project called Billy Penn, which was probably the best community journalism outlet in the city of Philadelphia. It really set a lot of interesting trends. Chris, of course, now is the executive director of Lion, the local independent online news organization, which provides training, support, and guidance for strictly online local news media that are independent. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris. And so the format, again, will be the same as it was yesterday because we're online. Chris will do a presentation first, then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for an open-ended Q&A session. So please hold your questions until after the break. Thank you so much, Chris.
Sure thing. Do you want me to present the slides, or do you want to run through them? Because I need permission to do that on the
John,
Zoom.
can you give Chris permission to show your slides? Yeah, just so long as you share the file or the PDF with us after, Chris.
I have sent you the link already, so you should be good to go.
Excellent.
All right, one sec. Cool. So let me revise a little bit of Bill's very flattering career history by giving some context. Bill and I actually met before we worked together at the Centre Daily Times. I was an undergrad at Penn State and Bill was a grad student, helping out when we used to develop photographs in a quaint place called a dark room with chemicals. So like very much the ending of the physical media part of publishing was where we started working together. But I was also taking an HTML course at the time, which after my 1.5-year stint at the Centre Daily Times, I parlayed into an internet job at the Morning Call as what was called a web producer, where my job was not to actually do any journalism, just put journalism online in many, instances, copying and pasting it into another document. Back when we used to have to, in order to update a website, you used to have to sort of republish the entire website, like every page of it, in order to update it. This was the days before database publishing. Anyway, Billy Penn still exists. It was sold to a public media station in Philadelphia. All 3 of the sites that we operated when I was at Spirited Media still exist in some form. 2 of them are now published by public media stations. Denverite is operated by Colorado Public Radio, and Billy Penn is a part of WHYY, where I understand it is actually more than earning its own keep through a membership program and events. It took longer to become profitable, quote unquote, than we could make it independently. But after another year or 2 of support from a public media station, was able to begin hiring and expanding, and remains pretty vital in Philly. And as a matter of fact, was able to sort of continue breaking news during the COVID-19 crisis in the city, produce some really interesting podcasts, expand into other media, has a really much more robust Instagram page than it did when I was there. Anyway, so it's continued to grow and evolve, which I'm actually, fairly proud of. Billy Penn and those efforts where I sort of spent a lot of time putting my heart and soul into a startup led to my next job here at Lion. Lion Publishers, as Bill said, stands for Local Independent Online News. I joined Lion 4 years ago, but Lion had been around since 2012. Grew out of it. And I didn't know this until after I started at Lion and learned a little bit about nonprofits. They follow life cycles in many cases, and those life cycles, it is not uncommon for a nonprofit to sort of form, have a very active volunteer board of directors, eventually scrape together enough grant money to hire a part-time executive director who then goes full-time. All of that had happened at Lion prior to my arrival. Right around the time that our local news websites in Philadelphia, Denver, and Pittsburgh were running out of money and we needed to sell them, the Lion job became open, and Lion had also been awarded $1 million grant from the Knight Foundation. And so looked at another way, I had just spent 3.5 years spending Jim Brady's money. I figured I could do worse than spending $1 million of the Knight Foundation's money. And what I really enjoyed in those instances was not just the news part of publishing, but building effective teams. Was what I really like to do, starting from 0 and going to 1, and then turning 1 into 2 and 2 into 4, et cetera, to hopefully make something meaningful on the other side of it. And that's what I saw the opportunity at Lion to be, not just an effective group of publishers, but if you cast out what in your mind what needs to happen in the next few years to replace a dying industry, there's going to need to be tens of thousands of these new independent publishers that need to exist. How might we start to build the ecosystem that they need to be effective? So that's what I looked at when I started at Lion. We claimed 300 paying members when I started, but in reality, we had 177 and we had terrible books. So it took us a few years to get that together. In 2021, I want to say we had 220 members. As of this spring, we have 450. So we've more than doubled our membership since then. As I said, Lion itself was formed in 2012. So we have a decent contingent of members, about a third, who are older than 10 years old as publishers. Which is interesting when you think about it, because the skills that it took 10 years ago to begin a website and a news publishing business are very, very different, given the publishing environment, than what you need to start from scratch today. And you see that on the other side of this chart, about a quarter of our members are less than 2 years old. So we've got a really kind of interesting and healthy balance, I think, of age in our cohort. It is by publishing age, right? Organizational age. It is interesting also to think about the makeup of Lions in terms of how much money they bring in. So this number doesn't sound big if you're used to publishing in the United States. $130,000 is the median revenue of a Lion publisher. But 2 more facts will help shed some light on this. 60% of our members, which is more than half, have 2 or fewer employees for their whole company, not just their newsroom. What does that mean? What does that look like? It means a individual, one person acting as a publisher, reporter, selling ads part of their day and writing stories and assigning them to freelancers the next. It's a husband and wife team where the husband sells the ads and the wife does the news, or vice versa. It is $130,000 for a team of 2. When you consider the median salary of a reporter in the middle of the country would be anywhere from $45,000 to $50,000. That's not bad. If you're also building equity in your own business at the same time. This number's gone up a bit. But the most important thing that we are seeing in our member data is that year over year, our members are diversifying the way that they're getting to that number. They're not solely selling advertising. They are launching membership programs. They are launching events businesses and things like that. This gives you the spread of how much our members are earning. So we, as I said, the median, that's a little misleading. You can see this breakdown and look at where our members fall. Almost 10% of our members make more than $1 million a year. Those 10% are places like Cal Matters, Vermont Digger, the Long Beach Post, which, unlike those other 2 examples, is a for-profit organization. Lion welcomes both nonprofit and for-profit members, and the balance is about 65-35 for-profit versus nonprofit. That's just a tax status. That's not a business model, because plenty of for-profit organizations do not earn a profit, and plenty of nonprofit organizations bring in more than they spend. So it is somewhat of a mindset and less an organizational principle, and we don't really pay much attention to that at Lion. But this gives you some idea about the spread of earnings among our members. I talked a little bit earlier about how those members get to that revenue number, and this slide lays it out a little bit more succinctly. When you look at the direct sold advertising for a Lion publisher, what kinds of businesses tend to advertise in their local news sources in a direct relationship-based way? It tends to be dry cleaners, funeral homes, a lot of the same organizations that if you're in a small town in America, you'll see supporting the Little League team in a church bulletin, or on a diner menu. It's a lot of the same types of businesses, like car dealers, very popular, health systems, right? Usually in almost every community in the US, the largest employer is the hospital system. Hospital systems have dedicated marketing budgets. And so a lot of our members spend a lot of time figuring out how to crack that and run advertisements that are tied to their local hospitals. Philanthropy funding is actually a third of all members' revenue, right? A lot of our for-profit members are fiscally sponsored and are able to accept grants through that relationship. I'm not sure. You'll talk to, I think, Sue Cross tomorrow and hear from Sue, who's at the Institute for Nonprofit News. And one of the fascinating quirks of the American capitalism system is the robust philanthropic network that basically exists so that rich people don't have to pay taxes. And nonprofits are the beneficiary of that. So it's a way to they sort of funnel money around. I'm not saying they're not good things that happen. There absolutely are, and it's a much healthier ecosystem than the journalism ecosystem. I can tell you after 4 years of working in it, it is much less bleak than working in a place where your workforce goes down by 20% every year. But it is a way for these newsrooms to pay for reporting increasingly is they build a relationship with a local community foundation. They're able to get a solutions journalism grant for a certain amount of money to do a project or things like that. But still, you'll see a pretty heavy reliance on advertising and relationship-based advertising, especially for the for-profits. I will say the fastest growing revenue stream for members is reader revenue of some kind. Most of that for our members, which tend to be small, tend to be membership, where you're asking people to support your mission by donating to your organization. And the way that typically works is by building up your email newsletter list. I'm not sure if you guys have talked about the idea of audience funnels or conversion funnels, which we talk about a lot in our industry. But if you think about how you get your audience to make a decision, you start with a wide, it's sort of an inverted triangle. The largest group of people are people who come to your website. A smaller subset of those people subscribe to your daily newsletter. A smaller subset of those people click on a link in your newsletter. And the smallest subset of those people decide they like what you're doing enough to pay you money, right? And so along that way, you lose a number of people, but what you gain on the other side of it is a paying customer, right? And so if you think about the goal of your article is not just to inform people, but it is eventually to get in their email inbox, because that is the first step to getting into their wallet. Does that make sense? This is what we talk about when we think about converting readers to members. It is slightly humbling to think that you are writing a news story to eventually one day get 10% of that audience to give you a donation. But in reality, that's how many people are starting to run their news businesses today, those that rely on reader revenue to help fund part of their operations. It is interesting to me, as I said before, that these members are changing the way that they raise money for their operations. And as I said, reader revenue is the fastest growing individual stream. I want to take a second and talk about the difference between a membership program and a paywall, both of which involve your audience paying you money to do a thing, but one puts a gate around your content and the other just asks people to pay to support it. Typically, something I've noticed, just having worked in journalism for a while, is the larger organizations tend to put up gates and attempt to charge more money to support a bigger staff, whereas smaller organizations and public media tend to launch and maintain membership programs. And most of my members are not large enough to command a paywall type presence, although we do have some who do. About 10% of our members have subscription-based businesses. And 40% of our members are still in the events business, which I can tell you from my time at Billy Penn is also a very effective way to convert a potential supporter into a sponsor, is by putting them in the room with the right kind of audience they're looking to reach. When we were doing Billy Penn in 2014, 2015, 2016, this was not the early days of the internet, but it was still very difficult for us at a regional level to sell an ad to the Philadelphia Eagles or the power company in the city, but it was easy for us to fill a room with the right kind of people or throw an event or something like that and get them to see the value of, a sort of young multicultural group of people in a space that they had paid for. Comcast was among that too, which you wouldn't think a sort of internet company would not necessarily see the value in an online ad, but we hadn't proved that we could reach the kind of audience digitally that they were looking for, but we could give them an event that met their needs as a company. So I imagine that playing that across hundreds of sites in the US. Bill mentioned that we're a nonprofit supporting local publishers, and I want to be very clear about our limits around that. We support the business side of local news. We don't try to tell our members how to write a better story or try to improve their ethics, figuring that there are plenty of places around the country and in other nonprofits that serve that need. There's a Society for Professional Journalists. There's training programs at places like the Poynter Institute that'll teach you how to do those things. There aren't enough places that teach people how to build stronger businesses. And so after our first couple of years of running some tests and running some small programs, we developed something called the Sustainability Audit, which is a diagnostic tool that we built to do a deep dive on a member's business and provide them with recommendations for how to improve it. We have done 150 of these audits so far over the last 2 years. We're going to do another 100 of them this year. This program is funded between the Knight Foundation, which renewed our grant last year, and the Google News Initiative, so it's partially platform funded. Anybody who goes through one of these sustainability audits, we match them with an analyst who's an expert in their field, who walks through in a very structured way and then gives them a report with recommendations for how to get better, along with a little bit of funding. Last year, it was $6,000 per auditee to help them improve those businesses. And so far, our members, let's back up. We're in the middle of this process now, actually, where we opened up applications for our members for the first round of 50 audits. Those applications are due by Monday, or Tuesday rather. So people are scrambling to get those in now. This is basically how long it sort of takes to do. The publisher, it'll take them 5 hours, but right now 5 hours get you $6,000, which isn't too bad. More important than the money are the recommendations that come out of it. And these are two actual quotes from actual humans who went through and publisher members who went through the process and have found their businesses came stronger on the other side, which is important to us as a nonprofit, not just, because it helps us get grants to do more of the work, but mostly because that's the mission, right? Find something and improve it, make it better than it was when you started. And the audit we are finding is doing exactly that for us, which is why Knight invested in us doing 300 more over the next 3 years. And we're in the first chunk of that 300 in 2023. That's all the slides that I had. So I am happy to, let me say a couple more things about Lion. So when I started, like I said, there was $1 million grant from the Knight Foundation to get started. I built support for the organization by fundraising from another journalism funder called the Democracy Fund, which was started by Pierre Omidyar, who was one of the guys who created eBay. So that's, tech money that supported that nonprofit. We also have received support in the past from the Facebook/Meta Journalism Project and the Google News Initiative. Most of our funding year to year comes from the Google News Initiative and from Google. They're our closest partner and funds most of our work. And so, like I said, when I started at Lion, we had no full-time staff. We had an interim executive director and 2 consultants who were working here. The Knight grant allowed us to hire our first non-executive director staff in the organization's history. We have 10 employees right now with accepted offers out to 2 more, and we expect to be at 14 by the end of this year. So we've gone from 1 employee to 14 over 4 years. Pretty rapid growth for this organization, and pretty rapid growth because the field and the members need it. So with that, I'm happy to talk about whatever you guys want to.
So Chris, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. So I have a couple of quick questions, especially about the audits. So what is the cost to the publishers, or is this the grant funds it, but there's just a limited number who get the audit?
The audit is free to publishers. We are able to capacity-wise do 100 a year because of the amount of work that it takes to run the program, hire the auditors, et cetera. But all of that cost is borne by the funders and not by the publishers. That we think that fulfills our mission as a nonprofit, right? So they go to the ones who need it the most, and we make it available on an application basis. But we're doing, literally 100 interventions in businesses over the course of a year, hitting up a good chunk of our members over the period of several.
So it sounds like you're pretty much at capacity with that. But if you could scale it, what would it cost if, like, for example, you said, hey, we can do this for a fee if you're willing to pay for it. And then, of course, we do have South African publishers here who are, the exchange rate between the rand and the US dollar is pretty abysmal. So, it's, American prices are out of reach for them, but is the methodology available to them in some way?
Yeah, I will say our goal is very much to open source this so that it can be applicable, not just the way we've been thinking about it is not just in our slice of the industry, right? Like, think about the site that I sold to public media. What would a sustainability audit look like for Billy Penn today? What it has to be a sustainable part of a larger organization. That's probably a different thing than we're doing. Take that to a, Black-owned weekly newspaper in the city of Philadelphia, or a Korean language publication in Los Angeles or something, right? Like, those probably require different types of measurement than we have. And then if you take that internationally, where Lion is just starting to operate a little bit in this year and next year in Canada, thanks to a separate infusion from the Google News initiative. But even looking at, there's government support for publishing in Canada. There are different operational rules and tax breaks that Canadian publishers have versus American publishers that operate in Canada. So it's just, there are complications that start to happen when you transfer your ideas across borders. I would say 80% of what we talk about at Lion is not truly region specific. When you talk about very, very small publishers, you're talking about people operating, as you all must know, with limited resources, right? When I talk about a business of 2 people or 1 person trying to both do the news and run the business side, it's a matter of husbanding those resources really carefully. And we find that our members don't tend to think of themselves as businesses or as products, right? If they're product managers, what they need to do is very carefully measure the effectiveness of what they're doing. And I'm not saying because they want to chase page views and eyeballs, but I'm saying if you're doing something and there's no measurable impact for it, then you need to stop doing that so you can start doing something that does have an impact, right? And does eventually redound to the bottom line. And so we find ourselves talking about best practices for, running experiments to test the effectiveness of the resources that they're expending. That means teaching people how to budget their time and actually build a budget, teaching people how to plan, teaching people how to strategically think about what they're doing. Because a lot of our members, I like to say, sort of ready, fire, aim their publication. They saw a need in their community and filled it with a news business and a URL. But once the adrenaline wears off and you've launched, how do you turn that into a sustainable organization over time? And a lot of this is stuff that I've been hearing about that predates the internet. Community publishers have known about this kind of conundrum for years and years. And one of Bill's and my mentors, Jock Lauder, who launched community newspapers in North Carolina, would talk about this using slightly different language when I was a student at Penn State in the 90s. So this predates the internet, but it does not mean that these problems have gone out of style. They've only sort of grown as it's gotten much, much easier for somebody to perform the act of publishing, but turning that publishing into a business. I mean, that's the trick, right? Like, people talk about local journalism being in crisis. I actually think that's not true. Journalism is not in trouble. It's the business of journalism that's in trouble. It's not a journalism problem. It's a small business problem. And that's how we think about framing it so that we can begin offering solutions. If you think about the word sustainability, it is incredibly bleak, because a sustainable organization is just one that is able to stay alive. And what we're saying when we talk about a sustainability audit is your business able to survive? not succeed, not thrive, but still be around in 6 months to a year. The fact that it's an open question and that we've had to invent ways to measure that just talks about sort of where we are in the continuum. With that being said, we still see at least 100 of these launching every year into the abyss, right? Not knowing whether there is a sustainable thing, but believing so much in the community's need for reliable local news and information that they're doing it anyway. And so we really find ourselves with our hands full. I changed my thinking pretty early on to try to, my initial idea was that we're going to need a lot more of these things because a lot of journalists are going to be out of work and we're going to have to create opportunities for them. But in good conscience, I can't tell that many people to jump into the pool until I tell them what the temperature of the water is, right? To use whatever metaphor you like. It's not that great of a business to get into. And so we need to do some work to make it better. And that's where we are today, if that makes sense.
That makes excellent sense. Okay, so Chris, we're gonna start getting questions then from the publishers here. So the way this works is we've got a roving mic and we've got serious feedback issues because we're also miking it through. Sorry. The question will be asked, but it also will be summarized in the chat. So if you don't understand the question because of the feedback, just look at the chat. Okay, who wants to go first? First question. Steve.
Okay, I'll start again. Okay, so thanks for that very inspiring presentation. We heard yesterday some examples of publishers who've been able to go from a once a week newspaper to a multifaceted business with a range of different revenue streams. And at the end of that presentation, some of the people in the room here said, you are like the mainstream media compared to what we are. We are operating at that very, very small level, often with 2 or 3 people, or maybe just one person. And you spoke about that as being a number of the publishers you work with being that, the 2-person operation. So the big question I'm standing with is, how do you scale yourself from a 1-person, 2-person operation to a thriving publishing business that has multiple revenue streams that are necessary in this environment? I know it's a huge question.
No, not
really. Can you give us any idea of what that typical journey might look like?
Yes. So last year for the last 2 years, we worked with the Google News Initiative on a structured application-only lab that we have run. At the time, it was called the Startups Lab. This year, we're going to call it a sustainability lab. And the reason I talk about it this way is because what came out of that is something we offered up to all of our members. Inside our website is a learning management system that we call the News Entrepreneur Academy, which lets our members work their way through courses. But one of the ways that we structured the learnings of this lab so that our members could take the learnings that small group experience together and just experience it on their own. How to create a staffing plan, how to create a revenue growth plan, how to assess your organizational capacity. These are all the steps that you would need to take in order to build a team to get to where you're talking about. And it's applicable whether you're a team of 1 or a team of 5 or a team of 10, right? It's all a matter of the time. And we offer this to anybody who's a Lion member to allow them to do the kinds of things that get you to be a larger team. That doesn't mean it's easy or quick, but we saw that the community sort of based approach, people just talking to each other, would only go so far. We needed to add some more structure to it. So we offer this to members, but we also run application-based programs that pair these lessons with cohorts, expert coaching, and a little bit of money to help people get through those stages themselves. I'm going to stop sharing again, but that's how we start thinking about getting to the point that you're talking about, realizing that it takes more than just, I don't know, desire to go from to take the path of a member of Lion, like the Vermont Digger, which started as one laid off newspaper reporter from a newspaper in Vermont named Ann Galloway, and she has since built and retired from the organization. It's now the largest newsroom in her state, right? Like that's all I have to do is do that 50 more times. I'm completely joking, but you see my point, right? Like that's and so we've tried this a couple of different ways, a bunch of different ways. Facebook funded a 2-year program to put a revenue generating employee in a dozen newsrooms. And we're just in the second year of that program now. It's been, it's not been like 100% of those publishers are all making money, but if you think about it like a batting average, it's, it's a solid batting average for those publishers, right? It's about a third have been wildly successful, and about 2/3 have had some version of success, and some weren't successful at all. But that's also, these are very risky small businesses. And so what we were trying to prove with that group of 12 is things that led to our developing different kinds of interventions over different kind of time periods, and really helped us determine the structured framework of the audit. If you think about that another way, it's a way to measure the foundation upon which somebody might build, whether that's an investor or a foundation or a local community or whatever. The sustainability audit can be an assessment tool for the ability of that business to bear more weight. Does that make sense?
Okay, next question is from Chris.
Hi, Chris. Okay, I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to start off with just saying that it's amazing what you guys are doing. And I think that AIP as an institution can also learn a lot from how you guys have structured your organization and the support that you guys are actually giving to their members. Excuse me. So the first question is, your membership structure and the mechanism that you guys use, could you perhaps just give us a little bit more insight into that in terms of how much are they paying and what benefits they are getting from that kind of membership? Obviously, one of them is the audit, the sustainability audit, which is amazing. And the second question is around selective news avoidance, because I've been following you guys since last year, 2 years ago, actually, since 2021. Yeah, something like that. And I was fascinated by your conference that you guys had recently, I think 2022. And you guys spoke about, selective news avoidance, and also around the unintentional news avoidance, which is kind of not looking at news alerts on your social media, and then the algorithms work with not serving you news. Eventually, you are not exposed to news. The reason I'm bringing that up, I just want you maybe just to touch on selective news avoidance and also unintentional news avoidance, and also how Meta is actually working with you guys in getting people to be more news literacy. How are you navigating with selective news avoidance with regards to advertising and also news literacy? I know it's quite a lot of things, but maybe you can have a stab at it. Thanks, Chris.
Sure. All right. Lion membership is a steal. I think it costs for most members $140 a year to join Lion. So I don't know, the cost of like 3 Starbucks trips a month or something is what most of our members pay. I think the most expensive Lion membership is $500 per year. We put another way, we basically lose money on every membership that we sell. It doesn't even support one full-time person's salary. And that's because we're a nonprofit that is mostly funded through grants and actually contract work. Believe it or not, we're this is weird to say, but Google is a client and we're a vendor. And the work that we do for Google, we invoice them for, and they pay us to do. And we'll talk about, I could talk about why in a second and sort of think about that and guess about that. But benefits that Lion members get in addition to community, right? The number one thing publishers tell us, and you guys know this as well as anybody, you're all trying to do a really hard thing. You're doing it geographically dispersed in far-flung places. So it can be lonely, frustrating, heartbreaking, and hard. And so when I started at Lion, And for many years, the way Lion existed, it was an online community, at this point, a Facebook group. And the best of that Facebook group would get drawn together once a year at a conference that was, and Bill will appreciate this, it was basically a punk show. I mean, the members themselves through the conference, board members were chosen as much for their ability to like put up lights and run microphone wires and carry things back and forth as they were strategically. The space was almost always donated where the conference was held. And the conference always either like broke even or lost money because it was more about the community coming together to talk about everything they needed to do to be successful. And no small measure that was commiseration with each other. And that thread has continued. We've sort of evolved that space from a Facebook group to a Slack community. That Slack community for us is, you remember I talked about audience funnels and conversions. So the most effective, and you guys should all sign up for our newsletter. It's free. We don't, the newsletter is not for members only. We have members only editions of the newsletter, but the newsletter is public. We have about, I want to say 1,800 subscribers. No, I'm sorry, 4,500 subscribers to the newsletter. So 4,500 people get the newsletter. About 1,800 of those are in the Slack community, right? And that has public channels too for people who might want to launch a news business, for researchers, for vendors, for people who are curious about the space. And then we have 450 members. So this is another example of when I talk about funneling and audience conversion, 4,500 to 1,500 to 450. That's a very clear funnel. And so in that Slack group, there are conversations not just about, generally as you would shout into a Facebook group, hey, I'm having trouble with getting an advertiser client to pay their bill, right? Or how do you make sure that a freelancer isn't selling their story to multiple publications? And these are all questions that I'd seen sort of crop up in the Facebook group, but in our Slack group, we can separate them by revenue, technology, job offers, job listings, those kinds of things, and try to encourage a little bit more searchable, segmented conversation. So like community, broadly speaking, is one reason people become Lions. Increasingly, another is the programs that we run and the access to those, which are offered pretty much only to our members. Another interesting thing that we did 2 years ago, actually, through a separate project I was involved on the board of directors with called the Tiny News Collective, is we basically built a media liability insurance program for independent publishers in the US at a significant discount. They won't let us say like exactly how much that is, but if you think about insurance being a very risk-averse business, you had basically hundreds of publishers in hundreds of localities basically going to a local insurance broker who had no idea what kind of risk profile a local publisher carried. And so insurers being insurers, they would charge them a lot of money to get media liability insurance. And so as a consequence, our members would either like pay too much for this insurance package or not take it out at all. We had members who assumed that their homeowner's insurance policy covered their news business. It did not. So what we had to do was work with a consultant to build a profile of a local publisher through an office that was used to dealing with media liability insurance. It's actually the same insurer that the international, what was it called? The International Journalism Consortium that published the Panama Papers, the ones that wrote about the Moffitt Fonseca, the bank that was, anyway, so like it's that same basic coverage plan, but scaled down for local publishers. So developed by attorneys, media attorneys with very clear ideas about, the right kind of protections and the right kind of affordability for local publishers. Those publishers' plans vary depending on whether they do more investigative work or mostly stick to municipal coverage or really only cover like food and drink, right? Because each one of those carries a slightly different risk profile. But we did create a plan that on the whole saves probably a couple of $1,000s a year for these independent publishers towards their bill. So this is another example of like something we offer our members, but we don't really do much with. We don't offer the plan ourselves because I don't want Lion to be in the business of deciding who should be insured and who isn't insured. And that's another reason why we don't offer health insurance, even though we know our members could use cheap health insurance, I don't want to be in the place of denying coverage to somebody. I don't think that's our job. So what else? I think as of last year, members get a free year of Canva Plus for joining, so they can, have some cheap design stuff. That just grew out of a conversation I had last year at the Online News Association conference with somebody from Canva who liked what we were doing, wanted to support the effort, and just decided to let our members have access to a pretty powerful tool for nothing, because they appreciate the work independent publishers do. So when folks are interested in that, we send them a discount code and they get to use this service for a year. I think yeah, those are the benefits that sort of exist right now. Shifting to the second part of the question, which was like 4 questions, I think, if I remember correctly. Selective. So let me talk for a second about the conference. Let me start there. So last year, for the first time, Lion collaborated with 2 other nonprofits, the Revenue Lab at the Texas Tribune, which is basically a separate nonprofit inside a very large nonprofit news organization in Texas. The Rev Lab's mission was basically to take what the Texas Tribune has done, which is basically run an events business with a newsroom attached, and teach other organizations how to run events and earn revenue. We partnered with them, and we partnered with the News Revenue Hub. The News Revenue Hub is a nonprofit that was formed out of the membership program of a nonprofit newsroom in California, the Voice of San Diego, to teach other organizations how to build and launch membership programs, and then teach them how to grow their audience so their membership programs will earn more money. We partnered with those 2 organizations on an event we called the Independent News Sustainability Summit. So deliberately broader than just Lion members, anybody interested in this space. We had more than 500 people come to Austin, Texas for 3 days to talk about the independent news, and like not just from across the country. We had people from Canada, we had people from Australia, people from Europe came to hear what we were saying, get immersed in the space, get inspired. We had funders who were there, we had researchers who were there, universities who were there, and spent 3 days just talking about the business of online news, and it was pretty great. Much bigger than our membership, right? So I can tell you confidently, we did not lose money on that event. We didn't make much money, and part of that was we spent a lot of staff effort and time pulling it together. And we're not doing an event that big this year because I almost broke my staff last year, and I'm not interested in burning out my team. So we're doing smaller regional events in 2023 with the aim next year, 2024, of pulling together a larger event like that. Potentially alternating, potentially, I don't know, we're still trying to figure out that part of our strategy. The selective news avoidance session was something that we started talking about when we started thinking about what the future of news was going to be. And in this country, we went from a few years of just insane news consumption because of some insane news cycles. We had, diplomatically speaking, non-traditional executive of the country who drew a lot of interest and therefore caused news consumption to spike. I'm trying to say this as neutrally as I can. At the same time, we had, as everyone knows, right, the first kind of global local story of my lifetime, which was a fast-moving and enormous story that touched on nearly every facet of existence, layered on top of a massive like civil rights explosion of events that happen around the country in terms of policing and attendant outrage in communities from coast to coast that followed that. So you had several touch points that drew an immense interest in the news. And then kind of predictably, after there was an election and some other kind of crises that happened, a brief and mild insurrection, we had people begin to not, deliberately or not, right, not want that same immersion in the news. We had a transition to an executive branch that seemed much less interested in making headlines. We had a period of relative quiet as crises began to step down. we had also, it's not that the amount of news had slowed down, it's just that people were generally sort of deciding to not be as up to the second because they didn't have to be. So you could look at it as news avoidance. You could also look at it as reverting to the mean, right? Like I didn't want to care about who the cabinet secretary for whatever was until I had, a few years ago been wondering whether it was going to be a literal Nazi or not. So there were like a lot of things that I don't want to have to worry. Like you could look at it that way as well, right? I don't know that the term news avoidance applies as much at the local level. What we were seeing at the local level was the creation of news deserts, right? The creation, what happened over, the period of time I've worked in journalism, like roughly 2000 until now, we're dealing with, and the sort of the rise of the internet, the rise of streaming technology, we're dealing with the primary way that communities were being informed, which were regional monopolies, right? The economics that underpinned those began to very quickly erode starting in 2008 with the Great Recession, which is when you saw newsrooms get markedly smaller year after year after year. I used to joke that newspaper revenue, the difference between newspaper revenue and roller coasters was that roller coasters went up sometimes. That never happened in newspapers after the year 2008. It's just been a steady downslide. And so what we've seen at the local level, as promising as these experiments are, we're still talking about hundreds of publishers versus something like 7,500 weekly and community newspapers across the country. So hundreds aren't going to make up for thousands. And someday I think that's where we have to go. So that's really the problem I'm focused on trying to help solve, is helping these very small publishers get stronger so that we can talk more people into the space. And start creating solutions at scale. At the same time, I think we have to be really careful that what we did in the previous era was create thousands of single point of failure systems, right? Where if that last place, your city that had a Times and a Picayune and now could no longer afford the Times Picayune, when the Times Picayune failed, there was nothing else, right? And so trying to create systems and ecosystems where there are more than one thing. So if one of those fails, another is relatively easy to get started, or they inform each other in sort of communities of news and information. So maybe not one giant shade tree, but lots of smaller shrubs. Sue actually talks very articulately about this. It's a metaphor that she developed that I've stolen. So like ask her about that tomorrow. But those are the systems that I think we're interested in trying to start creating here. If I recall correctly, your next question had something to do with algorithms and how, which I'm going to interpret as how people find news or how news finds people. And this is an interesting development now. I've spent the last year relatively involved in some legislative efforts to try to use public policy to help the local news industry. Let me preface that by saying that it's not uncontroversial to ask government to support news, right? Typically, those have been separate functions for very good reason, and news should be independent. But the government actually has a pretty long history using things like postal subsidies of actually supporting the news industry and it not affecting their independence at the slightest. There are a couple of different legislative efforts afoot to try to help the news industry. There are some that I find to be more successful, in my opinion, that tend to focus on informing communities and putting the communities at the center of that discussion. And there are efforts at trying to follow the lead of Australia and squeeze the platforms to pay publishers. And so I don't like that. I've been pretty vocal against that, as a matter of fact, not because Google pays me. Google pays Lion. Google does not pay Lion to lobby. Google can afford much better lobbyists than Chris Gruson. I like to think I'm a good talker, but I am not as good as somebody on K Street in Washington, D.C. who's paid a very handsome salary to schmooze with senators. That ain't me. I will say that then the reason I'm sort of talking in this way before your question about algorithms is there are a couple of ways prior to this year that news businesses could rely on their audience. One was people coming to that page directly, typing in your URL and coming to visit your site. And there are two other side doors that people would use. One was through social and one was through search, right? And a healthy news site, when I was running Billy Penn from 2014 to 2016 and change, when I was the editor, we had about a third of each, right? A third of our traffic was direct that came to us either via our newsletter or an individual story that they clicked on from our newsletter that we sent them, or they typed in our URL in the morning. About a third came in because somebody shared a link on Facebook and they clicked on that link. Primarily, Twitter has almost never driven measurable traffic to any news site. Primarily, when you're talking about social, you're talking about Facebook traffic, at least in that heyday. And then about a third from search, right? Whether that's Google News, somebody typing news.google.com and finding a story there, or if they're searching, who was the mayor, or famously at the national level, what time is the Super Bowl, right? And the only one that a publisher could directly control was their homepage traffic, their newsletter traffic, to some degree, their search traffic, right? Because you can optimize your content for search, but at the end of the day, that's not something that you can entirely control, how your content ranks on someone else's platform. As you probably know, since then, Meta has undergone some significant changes after first investing in the news business, building tools and technology to try to entice it, having a massive user data scandal and feeling the burn of investigative journalism around its products. Meta has stopped almost all its support for news, whether that was nonprofit funding. We, I think, total have received $2.6 million from Meta during my time at Lion. There was like 100,000 that was here in the bank when I started that we had received prior to that, but it's something like 2.6 or 2.8 that we've gotten since I started. That is done. That is gone. Everybody that we work with at Meta that handled news has been laid off or let go. Those departments are shuttered. Almost all the product support for news pages and news publishing, something called Bulletin, which was Facebook's answer to Substack, instant articles, all of that technology is dead. Facebook supports no more of it. And Facebook's algorithms and traffic have started declining rapidly to the point where I think social traffic to news is somewhere around 10% these days. We had stories when I was at Billy Penn go Facebook viral and would carry our site for, we did one story about why the Pennsylvania Dutch eat pork and sauerkraut on Christmas Eve that was perennially 1 million page views for Lion, for Billy Penn. And that is ridiculous. Like, that is entirely fueled by Facebook. That is almost entirely dead now, those kinds of traffic events when Facebook was algorithmically juicing its audience to find news. And that's the other part of this that I think we have to think about as publishers. This is true of Google search as well. They're not our audiences, right? These are people that are going to another place and finding our content through that other place, through that intermediary provider. So what we were doing was leveraging the audience, and we actually saw businesses. This is what caused the rise and fall of American startups like Vox and BuzzFeed and Vice. They grew fat on traffic numbers that ultimately were not under their control, attracted millions in venture capital that was attempting to exploit and figure out they could monetize other people's audiences. But all the advertising for those places wound up going to those intermediary platforms and not to the publishers themselves. Think about this a different way. And I teach entrepreneurial journalism at Temple University, so I think about this a lot. The sly genius of an advertising model at a Google or a Facebook versus a news provider, which typically your cost as a publisher to publish, you have to pay yourself a salary, you have to pay your reporter a salary, you have to pay your photographer a salary to create a piece of content against which you can attract advertising. When Google advertises, it's against something they're not paying for, a search. When Facebook advertises, it's against something that is even more insidious. It's something you create for Facebook, a picture you put there, a status update you put there, something you put in a group, right? Google's genius for the advertisement was, number one, only charging people when they clicked on the ad. And for Facebook, it was reaching, let's say, left-handed ping pong players in Sheboygan. Facebook could promise and deliver that audience where a news publisher couldn't. And the cost of a news publisher was always going to be higher than a platform, which the cost of creation of something to advertise against is nothing. So they're already disadvantaged from the start in those cases. The other fact when you think about it is the only reason that advertisers put their content next to news for many years in this country was reaching people was hard and expensive. And publishers were the best people to do that in a a reliable way in many communities. The first people to take money out of the pockets of newspaper publishers were not platforms. It was Walter Cronkite. It was the evening news. It was television. It started taking money away from newspaper publishers back at the turn of the century, which is what led to these regional monopolies that we saw. So sorry for the history lesson, but like, this is how I look at all of this today, which is about to be disrupted by AI, by, generative ways of a more conversational result when you search for something on Google or Bing, I guess, which I don't use, but apparently exists. And Google is experimenting, and there's no indication people actually want this, but experimenting with not offering a web page to you when you search for something, but instead summarizing what's there. We have yet to see how this is going to catch on with people. Because some of these AI are stunningly conversational and also wrong. So the part of Google being dominant as it has been for so long is because the results have been good. What that means for news is an open question. There's also generative AI for news stories. I'm not sure it's like a net negative. If robots are writing the what time is a Super Bowl story versus somebody that we're paying, that's not going to move the needle on me for quality news either way. But these are things that's important to think about and talk about as we're building businesses based on sort of shifting and unpredictable sand. So I think I hit every part. That was like an aerobics routine or something.
That was the first time that the answer to one of Chris's questions was actually longer than Chris's question.
I've exhausted my airtime. No more questions from you.
No, you're fine. Chris, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, we have already talked about the free content that comes into a typical community operation. Traditionally, it was the hatches, matches, dispatches, obits, things like that. AI, generative AI creates new opportunities for people to be able to submit that content, and then the AI can package it so that it's much easier and it requires less input in terms of editing, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody at Lion leveraging that other than Richland Source?
Other than Richland Source, I think we have some that are starting to. Believe it or not, we're going to use it when we start reaching out to. We have we're building something called a news entrepreneur marketplace, where we're going to connect all the vendors who operate in the space with members who need help, like building an audience program, building a newsletter, transitioning to a different website, et cetera. Like, there are people who do that, who are experts in that just for local news, and it's probably going to behoove everybody to be able to access them. And it's going to be better for those consultants to be able to reach a ready-made pool of folks. And we're going to actually put some money aside that we got from one of our funders to pay for like 1 or 2 hours of consulting work. So that's another member benefit that we're going to offer later this year. And we're talking about generative AI in the sort of application process, so that it's less like filling out a form and more like having a conversation. The part of, as you know, Bill, from your time in the trenches of, like, it's not that different, web page and coding versus page design, right? So to have robots do some of the really annoying coding stuff sounds fun, like a fine trade-off to me. I think members are just now wrapping their heads around what that's going to mean in the course of their businesses. I would not say, when I started this, I really thought of our members as startups. I wouldn't say that our members think of themselves as startups. So there's not entirely as comfortable a technological adaptation as I would like to see. And so I think we also have some older members. If you look at that third of our group, been publishing longer than 10 years and extrapolate out how old those folks are, they're probably not your early AI adopters. So I look to the younger cohort to see how that's going to look. And I think the Knight Foundation is about to announce some AI-driven efforts that'll wind up helping the local news space, probably after their board meeting in June.
With that, why don't we take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back for some more questions. Thanks, Chris. We'll see you in 15. Okay. That was a nice 20-minute, 15-minute break. Probably going to go on to 25 minutes, but sorry, Chris. People need coffee. Okay. Well, we're just going to get started and they can join us as we go. Okay. Who has the next question? Slindili. And hold on, Kizzy's got to get the mic. All right. Here goes Slindili.
Okay. So I have two questions, Chris. One, could you please elaborate on what do you mean by journalism is not in trouble, but the business of journalism is in trouble? And then also the sustainability audit. Are there questions that you put out? Can you maybe share some of the questions? Is it on your website? Thanks.
Yeah. When I say journalism is not in trouble, I believe that acts of journalism are going to
Chris, your
continue.
audio's off.
Are you sure?
Oh, you're all set. It was my fault. I have to mute the speaker manually to avoid the feedback. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Acts of journalism are continuing regardless of the economic underpinnings of them, whether it's a grant-funded investigation, a national organization like ProPublica partnering with a local journalist to enable a series to come to light, whether it's journalism happening in a Facebook group or a Nextdoor instance. There are acts of journalism on Instagram and Twitter every day that are voluntary, not the work of a person who is paid to report and write the news. So the act of journalism is happening almost independently of the funding mechanisms for it. Where we do not yet have a tested, reliable, repeatable template is, can communities count on reliable information that is mediated by a professional journalist? And there's differences there between the act of publishing as it exists today and some of the tools that we've talked a little bit about for enabling better journalism to happen, right? But I stand by that statement. I don't think we're in a crisis of journalism. There is more journalism today than there has ever been probably in the history of the world. It is more possible today to even in journalism's quote unquote golden age, they didn't have as much as we have today that's produced not just by professional journalists, but by subject matter experts. Today, you're as likely to run into a paper that's written by a nuclear physicist debunking an AI-driven piece of viral misinformation, or an emergency room physician talking about the in-person effects of COVID-19 as an eyewitness who doesn't know the technology or the virus or the pathology as well as those experts do, right? So it is not a question in my mind of a crisis in journalism, but we do see the sort of steep losses of paid professional journalists, people to be the impartial, independent purveyors of local news and information. Those are what we are in danger of losing. And so in my mind, the question is not the work, it's monetizing the work so that we can pay the salaries of people to do it. Does that make sense? Oh, hang on, there's muting issues.
Does on the one hand, but on the other, it sounds as if you are advocating or supporting this concept of anyone and everyone can just somehow wake up and be a journalist and publish unverified information simply because there's a platform to.
Well, I don't think that system needs me to advocate for it. That exists. I mean, that's not something that I'm.
Journalism.
It is journalism.
I disagree, but again.
I'm going to jump in here. So let's make a distinction between journalism, which is an act, and journalist, which is a person. Anybody can do the act of journalism. A journalist is somebody who does it professionally, either for a living or for an avocation. And so you are journalists who are trying to figure out a way that to sustain and grow your businesses, your financial stake in it, right? But you have many people in your communities who do journalism. Many of them do journalism through your pages, letters to the editor, op-eds, community submissions. That's all journalism. And they're relying on you to fix it up, to polish it, to just relay it, right? You are the social network in that sense, right? And so let's not confuse the act of journalism with the profession of being a journalist. Does that make sense?
I actually like some of the other, there are experiments. There's a organization in Chicago called City Bureau that operates a program that's been widely launched across different cities in the country and around the world called documenters. And what documenters are City Bureau has a program to train community residents to attend public meetings and fill out a form that sort of lists what happened in that meeting that is then provided to publishers across a city, so that otherwise events that would not have, the organization can't send a reporter to, they know what happened in that organization. Those documenters are trained, they're paid. I think they receive $35 or $45 for the meetings that they go and then document. That's something that sort of falls between the things that we're talking about, right? That's an act of journalism that's committed by a citizen, a resident, but they're not making a story out of it. They're filling out a form and posting that form online. So I'm fascinated by things like that. I think that's more of the closer to the future of what we will eventually get to than the sort of area we are now, which is we're sort of trying to navigate. To be clear, I'm not advocating and saying we should not have any paid journalists. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying the challenge is figuring out how to get people paid to do more of that work. And I'm not sure what that looks like at the end of the day. My goal is to, a world where more communities are informed. And if that means non-traditional things that are called journalism and facilitated by human editors, I still think that's an important piece. Don't get me wrong. I'm more trying to sort of be provocative and talk about a system that kind of already exists, where acts of journalism, to Bill's point, are happening all around us all the time. Does that make more sense?
I don't know. For me, the thing is with that, I don't mean to belabor the point, is that, part of the problems that we have with credibility, I'll give you an example. A professional journalist wouldn't publish a story of, say, in our country, for example, when it comes to a divorce case. If there are minor children, the divorcing couple, we can't name them, but someone on Facebook could very well just post that and talk about it simply because maybe it's a famous DJ who's divorcing, forgetting the fact that this is what media law in our country says. And then when sometimes there's backlash, people just somewhere say it's journalist. They don't distinguish between the fact that it was a community journalist who's not necessarily a professional journalist. We take, the fall as an industry of professional journalists. That's why I sort of have an issue with this.
Yeah, I hear
I'm
you.
going to jump in here because I understand what you're saying. There's bad actors in every profession, right? And so, and there is a degree to which the journalism sector has a very lucrative, very, very lucrative market for highly unethical journalism. There is a market to sell people lies they want to believe. There is a market for providing people with gossip and tawdry information that they want to know about, but an ethical journalist would find to be totally out of bounds, like the scandal sheets and the tabloid journalism, sensationalism, as you say, writing about divorces of celebrities and things like that. We cannot deny that they are in our sector, but what we can do is, if we want to sell journalism with integrity, if we want to stand out and say, we're not like that, we're not tawdry, this is something we're not going to do. We have to let our audience know that we stand for something better, that we're trying to live to the highest standards rather than the lowest standards of a very complex industry.
And let me be clear about something else. I fight for my members' ability to publish independently, but I don't tell them how to publish or what to publish. Like, we put some limits around who can be a Lion member and who can't. But I don't offer, again, I don't offer advice on how to write a better story. I don't offer advice on ethics. I mean, we have rules in our membership that you can't be a member if you unethically practice journalism, but the advice, the help that we give is around building stronger businesses. So that's where I'm focusing my efforts. And when I say that's where the problem is, of course, there are problems with unethical journalism practices. There have been as long as there's been journalism. But the crisis is in paying people to do journalism, in my mind. And that's what I'm focused on solving and framing it through this definition of a small business. Because almost all these publishers in our network, and frankly, if you look at digital only publishers, the traditional definition of a small business in America is fewer than 100 employees. The largest and most successful digital only local news provider is the Texas Tribune, which has fewer than 100 employees. So I'm trying to solve a small business problem, not necessarily trying to solve a journalism problem. Let me put it that way, right? It's not that that's not a problem. It's just that's not my problem. Other people who worry about that problem. I have more than enough on my plate to try to solve this one. So I'm also phrasing it like provocatively that way. But like, I don't mean to minimize the fact that there are people performing heinous acts and calling it journalism. My family, just to divert for a second, used to sell cars for a living. I've also been in telemarketing. So like journalism, telemarketing, used cars. I've pretty much done all the worst careers in America. These are like lawyer, maybe that's the only one that has a worse reputation than those three. So, you know, anyway, but I take that question. And now I'm going to share my screen again and talk about your question about the sustainability audit. I want to set it up by talking about how we define sustainability at Lion, which is more than just money. We view it as the intersection of these three pillars: operational resilience, financial health, and journalistic impact. If you think of it as a three-legged stool, any one of these things, if you're overbalanced, the stool falls over. And in those areas are, like, I can easily see from running a local news site where I could burn out by giving myself, putting too much effort into the news and not enough on the business side. Or if you think about money, if you give a place a ton of money, but their operations are not good, and then it's just like pouring water into a leaky bucket, at the end of the day, you could actually wind up making that news organization worse if it's not ready to receive the help that you're going to give it. And so this, to set up what I'm going to show you in terms of some of the list of questions that we ask as part of the sustainability audit, we think about, we break this up into sections. So there is a whole section on operational resilience. There's a section on just a general profile to get things started. Where are you geographically? What does your potential, total addressable market? How many people could you reach in your community? Are you single subject? Do you do investigations, et cetera, et cetera? And then we have this section on operational resilience. And what we ask is sort of some technological questions. How are you doing the work, technically speaking? How do you get paid for content if you have a membership program or you allow your audience to pay you, right? And then we talk about what else? So like, it's a 21-page document. I'm obviously not going to show the whole thing. Broadly speaking, you can divide publishers into how they bring money in and where money goes out. And so we look at trying to improve either side of that, because it's not just a question of improving resources. It's also a question of lowering costs. And so at the end of the audit questionnaire, we make recommendations to publishers about how to do both of those things. Does that make sense?
Next question. Dooney.
Good morning, Chris.
Hello.
Chris, do you mind to share with us, the document of program that you are saying you are doing with Google for 2 years? The reason I'm asking, in South Africa, the media as a whole, they went to Google and complain about a year that they're taking about 4 or 5 billion and without paying the tax. So Google have agreed to pay the South African media money, and will also be asked as a community media, okay, what do you want to do with that particular money, or what do you want the Google to do to you? So if you can give us that document, I think we can look at it. Probably it's one of the things that we can ask them to do for us. Thank you.
Okay. So we have run a variety of programs with Google. The first of which is this thing that I mentioned called, they actually pay for the sustainability and audits funding last year. So they gave Lion a certain amount of money, I think it was $1 million, to build the sustainability audits and funding program for last year. So that meant we picked the publishers to participate in it. We hired the coaches and analysts to work with those publishers. We opened up applications. We paid each of those publishers $6,000 at the completion of their audit. So that is one thing that Google paid us to do last year. The other thing that they paid us to do last year was something called the Startups Lab, which was the second year we did that with them. The Startups Lab was a program where Google paid us to, I think we worked with anywhere from 35 to 45 publishers last year in 3 different cohorts. Each went through a 6-week program. The first 6-week program was building and managing a team. The second was planning for revenue growth. And the third was, I think, building financial health. And you can sort of see that those match up with that Venn diagram that I showed you earlier, right? Each one tried for a different piece of that diagram. Each one of those programs was also like, those publishers received individual coaching. They were in a cohort, so they went through things together. They used courses that were in that News Entrepreneur Academy that I shared my screen and showed earlier. And each of them at the culmination of their program got something like $10,000 a piece to enact what they learned in the course of that lab. But that was a much more direct, hands-on, time-based intervention in an application process. So in other words, we hit 100 people, to talk about audience funnels again, 100 people got the broader help with a little bit of money. A smaller amount got slightly more help with slightly heavier intervention over a longer period of time with one-on-one help. So those are the 2 things we did last year with the Google News initiative, which is part of Google, but not all of Google. So the confusing thing when you're working with Google, which is a global company with sort of many arms, I don't know which part of Google is offering to help you in South Africa with what thing. And if they're working directly with you as publishers, that may be different than the kind of help they work with associations with, which help many publishers at once. So there may be a slightly different dynamic there that I'm not familiar with, but I'm happy to, like, those are the things that we did last year with Google. And this year, we're contracted to do, Google is funding just providing the funding for 100 sustainability audits. The actual audit part is paid for by a Knight Foundation grant. We combined them this year. And Google is also paying for something called the Sustainability Lab, which is a version of the Startups Lab. It's called something different because Google reorganized. But it's the same theory. Over a certain amount of time, we're going to help, I think, 36 publishers with a certain dedicated aspect of their business.
Next question is from Shirley.
Hi, Chris. My name is Shirley Govender. I'm a digital and print publisher in the Deep South Johannesburg. I wanted to find out from you if you are running any programs on a face-to-face basis outside of the US, and would Lion consider doing such with the AIP publisher community in South Africa?
That's a good question. Right now, we are just launching an international program, but in Canada. So like way closer to home. We already have about 20. So we have 450 members, about 24, about 24 are in Canada. And last year, I attended an event in Montreal that Google hosted called Newsgeist, which exposed me to on-the-ground publishers in Canada, which I know nothing about South Africa and its laws or its makeup, but I will tell you that it was surreal to be in a country that's so close to the US and hear so much envy of the US nonprofit system and the money that publishers in that country saw flowing through it. And Canada doesn't have anything like that. They have some foundations, but it's mostly program-based money so that journalists who are working on a story that's funded a certain way can access nonprofit funds, but generally not to support the operation of existing or new news businesses. And I started to hear more about the needs of those independent publishers in Canada. But Canada also has like government support of publishing. Canada has different rules. And the other part of it that's fascinating to me as an American is the platforms that we talk about sucking up the advertising money. At the end of the day, they're American companies, but they're American companies operating internationally, which are also sort of taking money out of other countries. And Canada feels that very acutely. So at the same time, we had just finished running a program. We used to run something called the Startups Boot Camp that Google also funded. We ran a Canadian version of that to help potential entrepreneurs go from an idea to a minimum viable product. Google really liked that and wanted Lion to operate in Canada. Frankly, they wanted me to hire, they wanted me to ask them for money to hire a full-time person in Canada, which I wasn't prepared to do because I didn't know anything about the space. What we talked them into doing was a research project where we would look at the landscape, talk to a bunch of publishers in Canada, come back with recommendations about what they would need, which would also give us the seeds to start potentially running programs there. They gave us some money to hire that person. We're about to announce who that is, but that work is just getting started right now. We'll provide a landscape analysis, potential funding opportunities, and give us a place to start should we decide to, next year, take them up on that offer to hire a full-time person there, with the goal for everything of making that sustainable beyond Google. In case Google one day decides to stop funding what we're doing, I'd like to be able to make a promise to a person that we hire that they can still have a job if our initial funder isn't there anymore. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's the amount of work that's taken us to operate in one country relatively close to home. I'm not sure if it's the best use of our time to operate a branch of Lion in South Africa versus helping something get started in South Africa, which I'm happy to do, and have done. About 2 years ago, like teeth of the pandemic, I did a call with the Judith, I'm going to screw this up, the Judith something foundation in Australia. It's funny because when I emailed them, I called it the Judith Light Foundation. And Bill, you might know her as the woman from Who's the Boss? It's not the Judith Light Foundation, and you shouldn't tell the Judith Foundation that when you're emailing them. And I did. And she is, by the way, the richest woman in Australia. So anyway, I spoke to this conference there, and about a year later, and this is in many ways the way Lion started here, they started something called LINA, which is the Local Independent News Association, run by a woman named Claire Stuckberry, who used to be a government minister. LINA got money from the Judith something or other foundation. I'll look it up. I mean, it's Google. But yes, Judith Nielsen. Thank you very much. Not the Judith Light Foundation. Judith Nielsen Foundation. Got money from the Judith Nielsen Foundation to get started, and then wound up getting $1.5 million in the government budget that was just passed in Australia annually to operate, which is fantastic for them. I think they have something like 45 members as of right now. But that came about after I spoke to a bunch of independent publishers in Australia. So I'm happy to take that interim step if that's helpful. And it may be that it gets something going faster. I think that may be better than sort of waiting for us to get to South Africa in our grand plans of taking over the world. No, I have no such plans, right? It's important to me that our Canadian operation, for instance, be able to stand on its own in Canada, and any money we take in Canada stays in Canada. Like, we have enough people here in the US. We're a nonprofit. I don't need to make a profit. I want to be able to, succeed, build a reserve, be able to make the promises to the 14 people we will employ here next year that they have a job as long as they want one with Lion, before I get to, growing too fast or too far. So I'm certainly happy to, help take whatever steps that might lead to you getting a version of this where you are. And I'm happy to talk about how to make that happen after this, if that's something of interest to you all.
Question. Next question. Are we really out of questions? Can we let Chris get back to work? Chris, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, man. Happy to do this. Good to see you again.
So, Chris, I promise you, I will mail you a lanyard to hang on your trophy wall there.
Thank you, right? I get
Yeah.
around a little bit to conferences. Yeah.
I've got to print one out for you, but I'll send it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. And of course, people will probably have questions. What I'm asking them to do is send me questions And then I will, to make sure there's no redundancy or anything else like that, and then I'll forward them to you.
Sounds great. Thanks,
buddy.
everybody. Good to talk. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Good luck.